Yeah. All right, so I think we're just because we took a little bit longer on this session than we intended, we're going to move to Assistant Commissioner Lucy Jaffe from HPD, and she's going to present some more data to us. Deputy Commissioner? I'm sorry, Assistant Commissioner?
Good morning, Chairman Reese and members of the Rent Guidelines Board. I'm Lucy Jaffe, Assistant Commissioner for Housing Policy for the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. I am pleased to be here today to discuss some of the recent work in which HPD has been involved. I'd like to start by providing an update on Housing New York, HNY. As you know, this was originally designed as a 10-year, 5-borough plan to create or preserve 200,000 units of affordable housing. In October 2017, the mayor announced an expansion of HNY 2.0 to 300,000 units by 2026. In 2018, the city financed 24,061 preservation units and 10,099 new construction units. Based on average household size, these new and preserved units are enough to house nearly 68,000 New Yorkers. We are working in all 5 boroughs with about 7,000 units in the Bronx, 15,000 units in Brooklyn, 10,000 units in Manhattan, 3,000 units in Queens, and 100 units in Staten Island. The majority of these units, or nearly 60%, serve very low-income households, or households earning less than 50% of HUD income limits, which for a family of 3 is equivalent to about $47,000 per year. In fiscal year 18, HPD and HDC marketed over 7,800 units across 154 projects on Housing Connect, HPD's online affordable housing lottery portal. In order to make affordable housing lotteries more accessible to more people, HPD also expanded our Housing Ambassadors program. There are now 46 ambassadors, nonprofit partners who assist New Yorkers with the application process, working in a variety of neighborhoods. Assistance from ambassadors is available in 16 languages, and there are 4 organizations that specialize in serving applicants with disabilities in particular. It is imperative that we make affordable housing accessible to all New Yorkers, and senior housing is a priority for the de Blasio administration. To date, the city has financed about 7,000 senior units as part of the commitment to create 15,000 new apartments for seniors under HNY. This commitment was recently expanded under HNY 2.0 and Seniors First to serve an additional 15,000 seniors through aging in place efforts. HPD, in conjunction with the Department of Social Services and City Hall, also struck the first deal to transition over 1,000 residents in nearly 500 cluster units to permanently affordable housing. Joint ownership entity NYC and Neighborhood Restore will acquire the buildings, and they will be managed in partnership with local nonprofit organizations. In addition, nearly 10,000 units of the units financed through calendar year 2018 under HNY have been set aside to house formerly homeless individuals. As you know, we do not focus exclusively on housing production. HPD is also responsible for handling housing maintenance complaints and violations. In fiscal year 18, HPD closed 114,641 emergency heat and hot water complaints and issued 11,143 emergency heat and hot water violations. About 80% of the heating service requests were closed within 5 days of being opened. HPD also issued 13,466 violations for mold in response to 22,746 complaints received, and issued 25,753 violations for mice and roaches in response to 29,382 complaints received. When necessary, HPD can charge landlords for repairs, utilities, and fuel through the Emergency Repair Program, ERP. In 2018, ERP charged landlords in more than 6,000 buildings. Several HPD programs focus specifically on the identification and improvement of our city's distressed housing stock, which has long been a priority for our agency, including HPD's Alternative Enforcement Program, AEP. These programs focus on the identification and remediation of troubled buildings to ensure that poor building conditions are addressed and to prevent this important housing stock from falling into disrepair and abandonment. At the beginning of each year, HPD designates severely distressed multiple dwellings for participation in AEP. Buildings are selected based on the class, hazardous and immediately hazardous, of housing maintenance code violations, and the amount of emergency repair charges incurred as a result of the work performed by HPD. HPD designates the 250 most distressed buildings citywide each year for the program. Round 12 buildings were selected on January 31st, 2019. These 250 buildings have more than 37,000 violations and owe more than $11 million in municipal arrears. Besides working to ensure the quality of New York City's housing stock, HPD is also working to keep owners with 421A tax benefits in compliance. The 421A compliance unit sent 5,500 notices to non-compliant owners that their benefits would be suspended if they did not comply by January 2018. HPD has begun the revocation process for these properties that were not in compliance by the deadline. In addition, just under 4,000 suspension notices were sent to condominiums that were receiving benefits without having a final certificate of eligibility on file with the Department of Finance. These properties have until January 2020 to comply. HPD is also launching 2 new programs in HNY 2.0 to help make home ownership more accessible for all New Yorkers. HomeFix offers low-interest loans for home repair to low and moderate income homeowners. HPD is excited to partner with Enterprise Community Partners to offer loans to 100 homeowners per year, or 800 by 2026. Open Door finances the construction of co-ops and condos for households earning between $75,000 and $122,000. The program is expected to serve more than 200 homes per year. In addition to offering loans, HPD also offers services to homeowners to prevent foreclosure. The Homeownership Help Desk in East New York was launched in September 2017. Since then, the program has conducted outreach to 3,500 homeowners, hosted 12 outreach events, educated 2,000 homeowners, and assisted 350 homeowners with foreclosure prevention and financial and legal counseling. The city has also supported the acquisition of distressed FHA and Fannie Mae notes through the Community Restoration Fund program, which helps homeowners receive mortgage modifications. HPD supports owners by providing opportunities for assistance in maintaining their buildings. HPD is committed to supporting tenants so that they can remain in their homes. In winter 2018, HPD launched the Neighborhood Pillars Fund, which provides low-interest loans and tax exemptions to nonprofits and mission-driven organizations to acquire and rehabilitate unregulated or rent-stabilized housing for low to moderate income households. As part of the program, HPD partnered with Restored Homes to launch the Down Payment Assistance Fund, with funds from the Community Preservation Corporation, Wells Fargo, and HPD. The Down Payment Assistance Fund is available for qualified nonprofits to use to finance contract deposits on building acquisitions. Excuse me. With respect to buildings in HPD's portfolio, we've preserved 13 buildings, 211 affordable units through the Affordable Neighborhood Cooperative Program, ANCP. We are currently working on converting 5 buildings, or 55 units, to HDFCs through ANCP. The Multifamily Preservation Loan Program has preserved over 600 affordable units under HNY, many of which have been under city ownership for over 25 years. The city is also committed to eliminating tenant harassment. In July 2018, Mayor de Blasio announced the formation of HPD's Tenant Anti-Harassment Unit. This unit is dedicated to bringing claims of harassment against landlords in housing court. They will inspect 1,500 buildings and bring 100 cases annually. The City Tenant Harassment Task Force, a joint effort by HPD, the Department of Buildings, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, the New York City Fire Department, and the New York State Homes and Community Renewal, has attempted to inspect over 650 buildings, 11,500 units, as of January 1st, 2019. In this time, HPD has issued over 27,000 violations to these buildings, and just over 100 of them have ongoing cases in housing court. In September 2018, the city launched the Certification of No Harassment pilot, a 3-year program affecting 1,000 buildings. Under this pilot, owners of certain buildings are required to obtain a CONH prior to acquiring Department of Buildings permits for any work involving demolition or change in use or occupancy. Finally, as I'm sure you all know, HPD conducts the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, NYC HVS, about every 3 years. The most recent survey was in 2017. The NYC HVS provides invaluable information on the city's housing stock and its residents, specifically when it comes to rent-stabilized units. In 2018, HPD published 3 brief reports on the stock of rent-stabilized units with data from the NYC HVS. These memos were published with the aim of providing the public with accessible, useful information on rent regulation. In memo number 1, Sociodemographics of Rent-Stabilized Tenants, HPD reported on demographics, income levels, and employment of tenants and households in rent-stabilized units, as well as private unregulated rental units. This memo reported that higher proportions of rent-stabilized residents identify as members of a racial or ethnic minority group, live alone, and have an older tenant in the household than private non-regulated units. A larger proportion of rent-stabilized households are very low income compared with regulated households, 27% of stabilized units versus 19% of unregulated units. Conversely, a larger share of households in unregulated units earns more than 80% of HUD income limits, 52% of unregulated units versus 36% of stabilized units. Memo number 2, affordability of rent-stabilized units, focused on housing cost and rent burden and included breakdowns by borough and length of residence. In memo number 2, data from the NYC HVS showed that the median rent for unregulated units is about $450 more than the median rent of stabilized units. However, the discrepancy is much larger for residents that moved into their units in the last 18 months, about a $750 difference. For households that moved into their units before 2007, the difference is only about $150. The third memo, quality and
I'm sorry, can you say, where is that information in memo 2 that breaks it down by the time of moving in? Page 3. Oh, I got it, I found it. It's in table 2. I'm with you. Okay.
You're faster than I am.
Thank you. Alex found it.
The third memo, quality and accessibility of rent-stabilized units, looked at both the prevalence of maintenance deficiencies in rent-stabilized and unregulated units, as well as how these types of units compare with respect to accessibility. Memo number 3 reported that units in buildings built before 1947 were more likely to report having 3 or more maintenance deficiencies than units built after this time. Regardless of year built, however, the share of rent-stabilized units with 3 or more maintenance deficiencies was higher than that of unregulated units. In the pre-1947 group, about 20% of rent-stabilized units reported having 3 or more deficiencies, compared with about 9% of unregulated units. We plan to continue to use the NYC HVS to provide valuable insight on the city's housing stock and residents going forward. Data from the NYC HVS are public and used by researchers, policymakers, and housing stakeholders to inform the conversation around housing issues in the city. Thank you for this opportunity to update you on HPD's programming and share some additional findings from the 2017 NYC HVS. We look forward to further collaboration with this board and are available to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Any questions from the board?
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned that HPD has special loan programs for buildings, but do you know how many units do they need to have in order to apply for these loans?
For which in particular?
The loan programs that they have available for homeowners.
Oh, Home Fix and Open Door?
Yeah.
We can get back to you. We can get back to you and confirm on that.
Yeah, we're happy to provide eligibility information to you. I can follow up with Andrew and get it to you guys.
How many of the units that you guys financed in buildings, new construction or gutter rehab, were rent stabilized, and at what levels were they?
So as you know, the vast majority of the units that we preserve or build become subject to rent stabilization or remain rent stabilized for the duration of the regulatory agreement. So almost all of these numbers, with the exception of a very small number of units and homeownership programs, are equivalent to the contributions to the rent stabilized stock.
And do you have a breakdown of the rent levels for those units?
Sure, we can send you a chart of all of that.
Because I think it goes into some of the data we were talking about earlier around what are the units that are outside of that range of the $1,300? Sure, about $1,300.
We'll send it by rent as well as income level.
That's great,
right?
thanks.
Okay.
I didn't have a chance to review these before, but thank you for providing them. How is scree and dree being handled in these? Is it pointed out or it's not pointed out, the number of people who are using it over time or participants dropping in, dropping out?
Sure. So the HVS collects data on scree. We have historically not collected information on DREE, although we have that as administrative data. These particular memos focus on the overall stock, and so doesn't separate out or handle scree recipients in any separate way. But if that's of interest to you guys, we'd be happy to pull numbers on that.
I think that would be helpful, because on one of the pages, it indicates, something like 31% of the rent-stabilized housing stock is a person over 62, but I think scree starts at a younger age.
It starts at 62.
62? Okay, yeah, I just would like to understand that.
Sure.
I mean, I think even maybe further to understand if they are, what their portion is and what the finance department sort of covers, because I do feel like it helps us gauge the affordability. I think last year we had a conversation around, is that coming straight from the tenant themselves, and does that matter? And then for me, I think it's even further that if that tenant leaves for any reason, death, or they move out, it actually impacts the legal rent at the end.
Right.
Because that legal rent becomes the new rent that the new tenant will pay. They don't get locked in scree or dree. And so I do feel like it's a good indicator as well.
So what we can try to do, I'll do my best, is to look at not just the number of scree recipients over time within that share, but possibly also the difference between legal and actual rent being paid. We'll see if we can work on that.
I'm just kind of thinking out loud about the 3 reports that you provided and kind of how they relate to the decisions that we have to make. And what are your takeaways in terms of these 3 reports? How do you think they're relevant to our decision-making?
You want me to answer? Sure. Then you can follow up? Yes. So we think, obviously, there's a tremendous amount of reports and analytic work that is done here by the RGB and your staff, but we think that the HVS is particularly relevant to understanding the current situation of the tenants within that population, right? As opposed to only looking at the costs and the overall changes, the HVS is uniquely positioned to describe who the people are that are being impacted by this board's decision from the tenant side. So I think it's very valuable for all of us in the city to understand that rent stabilization really does serve a lower income and more vulnerable population. There's a lot of debate, not only on this board, but I think in New York City as a whole, of whether rent stabilization is well matched to the need. And our data have shown over the last 30 years that rent stabilization, while it's not means tested, of course, does largely serve a population that really would otherwise struggle in private unregulated units. I think the other side of this, it's important, particularly in the third memo on quality, is to actually sort of address some of these concerns about investment in the rent-stabilized stock, which continues to be an issue, despite having by far the best quality housing stock ever recorded from the HVS since we began the study in the 60s. Rent-stabilized units do lag behind in terms of quality in the unit, although it has improved over time fairly steadily. And so understanding that disparity, but also that overall improvement in the stabilized stock is pretty important to understanding how these policies play out for incentives to invest.
Nothing to add to that.
I mean, I think the other thing that you guys have done a great job is making sure that you're providing support for ranges of landlords if they are in distress and do want to tap into the resources that you guys offer, including making repairs and making sure those units remain affordable in some way, because you do have more leverage in that relationship. And so I think if you wanted to share any numbers around that, I think that they would help enlighten some of our, like, we don't talk about it as much, but I do feel like it's a resource that if a building is distressed and the landlord, I know that it's a long process and sometimes they're difficult, not that you guys are difficult, but it's a difficult process, and I do recognize that, but that there are resources that you guys provide to help alleviate some of that need to ensure that we do have a better, healthier housing stock.
Sure. I mean, if I can just add to that, I think not in the analysis that we shared per se, but especially in Lucy's testimony and the numbers that we provided on HPD's overall production and investments, it is important to realize that part of what HPD's function is really to help support those owners that are struggling for whatever combination of reasons, to help directly support them and get their buildings into a more sustainable state, both financially as well as physically. And then on the other hand, for owners that are not able to, then we have enforcement and other kinds of action programs that help to protect the tenants in those sort of worst off buildings.
And that's regardless of building size.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Apologize if I missed it, but I think it would be helpful to understand compared to the data that we just saw from the staff on income and expenses, the number of buildings that have gone through an HBD program to assist with either maintenance or capital repair or some other type, and that change over time.
Sure. We can work to do that and try to get it as close to an apples to apples as we can to the I&E reports.
Yeah, that would be great.
Can I
Go ahead. One second. So, this is Elizabeth Gomer. I don't think we actually officially introduced. If you could just tell us your title and your role.
Sure. Elizabeth Gomer, I'm Assistant Commissioner for Research at HPD, and I run the HVS.
I wasn't going to let you get away without.
I'm just
letting
Lucy's
us know
sidekick
you were.
today.
No introduction.
So I'm just curious if you have this data. I'm not sure that we need to see this data, but when you're, the takeaways that you gave of the three reports seem to be the most important aspects of them. When you talk about the sociodemographic data and you say that rent-stabilized tenants are a lower income, more fragile slice of the New York City population than the general, the unregulated tenants, do we have a break? Can you break that down by deciles? Like, are there outliers in the top 10%? And I'm not sure that we need to know that now, but I'm curious as to whether you could do that.
Absolutely. We'd be happy to prepare some distributions on income and also the distribution of race, ethnicity, and age, and household composition, those basic characteristics. Sure.
Thank you. And then in terms of the quality of the housing stock, you mentioned the historical data. Just looking at it really quickly, I wasn't sure if I saw it in this report. Is that readily accessible? That
We do have information on our website as well as the census's
Okay.
website. Some of our earlier testimony last year to the city council, and I think also to RGB, we provided some of those data over time. Be happy to follow up and send that to you guys so you have the link. The memo is really just looking at the present state, but we've done quite a bit of analysis looking at that over time.
Yeah, I think those deciles are helpful because I say this every year, but the people who testify, we never hear from anyone who pays the average rent. We never hear from anyone who pays under the average rent. So 50% of the people, we never hear from really anyone. We hear from people who pay rents between $1,400 and $1,900. I mean, that's really who comes to the community forums. So I'd just like to have a little bit more clarity on all these people who have lower rents. Obviously, it's working out, or it's not bad enough that they come forward.
So we'd be happy to do that, and if there are other sort of metrics that you're interested in looking at those distributions, to the extent that we have those data, we're happy to share. On that last point, I will add that in looking at the HVS historically over time, we saw a very large reduction in the lowest cost units between 2014 and 2017. It was actually quite a dramatic change and shift upwards in the rent distribution. So to the extent that we look currently at the rent levels, it's noticeably different than it has been even in just very recent years. So we can share that as well with you guys.
I mean, I think a good point to that is also even further is to say that, like, to your earlier point, that you can even look at who's moved recently in the last 18 months. And so if that's a good indicator of people shifting or moving around in the city, I think it actually talks about like the bonuses and all of the rent increases, other increases, and moving into a new apartment's more expensive than if you've lived there for 30 years. And so I think that would be interesting to look at.
do you have a sense of why there was that big change between 2014 and 2017, or was it?
It's just been driven by rent increases. There have been really tremendous amounts of rent increases among the lowest cost stocks, like the bottom probably 20% of units. When they become vacant, that those rents go up very substantially.
Some of the data that you have in the memos, we have in our reports too, and it crosses over. But we can certainly work with Liz. We have the data set as well, so between the HPD and us, we can hopefully answer these questions. Do you have a sense of how many units have become registered that should have been registered as 421A? And I know that you sent over 4,000 notices to buildings that hadn't actually complied with the law and registered their units. Are you keeping track of the units, or is HCR, like, where does that, how do you know they comply at the end of the day?
It's based on coordination. We have our team at HPD, and we are certainly working with HCR on that. The enforcement obligation remains with HCR, but we're certainly committed to making sure that our portfolio is compliant.
Okay. So to get final numbers on the number of units that are 421A that have been registered over the last registration period, that would be ultimately with HCR.
Yes, ultimately it would be, and you have those data as well as we do, but registration is obviously with HCR, and to get those numbers requires it from their system. But I guess from the data side of this, for those of you who don't know, many times when we issue reports based on HCR data, and that's anybody who has access to these, it can sometimes underreport some of the compliance issues if we're using slightly dated information. And so particularly where there have been large compliance efforts, we have been told by our colleagues and partners at other agencies and at HCR that there's often, because there are new registrations coming in, then it sort of requires a refresh of the data. So if HCR has already testified, or that may be a question that you can ask them, but otherwise I'm also happy to coordinate with our folks in tax incentives and get you up-to-date numbers on 421A units that have registered.
Any other questions or comments from the board?
Andrew, maybe that's a question to ask them when they come around, when whatever numbers they give us, are those, when are they?
Well, there's two ways they report it. One was we get registration data from 2018, and we take a look at the number of newly registered 421A. So we'll get a number from HCR. There's clearly a lag time between the April 1st, 2018 and the code enforcement that's being done. So it's not going to capture all the folks that have unless they registered after that, which they may have. I'm hoping HCR is here at our next meeting. That's the understanding, but I cannot say that for certain. That's my hope. They've been sent our questions, as we always have, and they should respond with those at the very least. But we will ask, and I'm sure we'll get an answer.
No other questions? Thank you so much. These presentations are always so helpful to us. Thank you.
And can we get a copy of your testimony?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks.
Should we go to Danielle? Or?
Unless you need a break.
Yeah, would anyone like to take a 5-minute break? Or yes, let's take a 5-minute break and then Danielle. Thank you.